Today we're going to take a look at a watch from Orient that's a little more unusual. When most people think of Orient, they think of great, affordable automatics like Mako and Ray and Bambino. Yet today's watch is not an automatic. In fact, it's a solar chronograph. And while this watch is not completely unknown, it does tend to fly underneath the radar for most people. And I think that's mostly because it's a JDM specific model. The line is referred to as the Neo 70's, and as the name suggests, it has some retro 70's design elements, namely color. There is of course a Panda version, which is what I was going to order, but ultimately I went for this gray version. Although I did order this months before I got my Mako X, which Orient USA has now officially named as the Kamasu, which means Barracuda. And this particular one seems to have a very similar red color on its dial. So if I was to do this over, this one would be pretty tempting. Although before we get too deep into this watch, I do want to point out that not all Neo 70's chronographs are solar powered. So if that is one you want, make sure you double check the model number against Orient Japan's website, which I'll have a link down below. Otherwise, let's get the specs out of the way and start to take a closer look. Orient Japan has these listed as being 42 millimeters wide, and I found them to be just shy of that. With the crown, they're more like 44.5. Meanwhile, lug to lug is 48.7. So overall, it's not too bad a footprint, and it should be just fine for most people. Height-wise, we're at 11.7 millimeters, so it's not too tall, especially when you consider the depth and complexity of the dial. Lug width is 22 millimeters, so lots of strap options out there, and you will need them, but more on that later. Weight with its bracelet is 130 grams, which is a little lighter than I was expecting for its size, and it has a good 100 meters of water resistance, so short of diving, it should be good for whatever life throws at you. MSRP on Orient Japan's website is 32,000 yen, which I think is around $290. Yet you should be able to find them on eBay for around $230, give or take. The case is stainless, with a mixture of brushed and polished finishings, depending on where you look. The sides, the back, and the bezel are highly polished, while the top of the case is a brushed finish which matches the bracelet. And I think this gives it a nice two-tone effect against that polished bezel. Looking at the side, you can see that the bezel has an interesting shape, where from the top it slopes down past the case and then tapers back to meet it. And you can also see the mineral crystal rising out of the bezel at a similar angle, letting it resemble a flying saucer sitting on top of the case. The lugs are rather short, and they have a nice downward and inward angle as they come down to the bracelet. A screw-down case back is on the back, although hopefully you'll never have to open it, at least for a decade or two. A signed crown is at the 3, along with your standard chrono pushers. They look good, and they do match the case design, but there's nothing particularly special about them. The response when you engage them is also not particularly noteworthy. The top pusher goes in without any particular feedback and feels a little hollow, while the pusher at the 4 does have a little bit of a click when you engage it. One nice thing about the chrono is it does have 1/5 of a second accuracy, so you have a nice sweep that goes along with that. There's a lot going on with this dial, so let's start at the outside and work our way in. A black raised chapter ring surrounds the edge and visually acts as a frame for the rest of the dial. Rather than a tachometer, it has minutes and seconds, which may off-put some, especially if you're wanting a Panda as a Daytona homage. Yet I find this more useful in day-to-day life than a tachometer. Just inside of that, you have the hour indicators. It's a silver strip with raised silver bars as indicators that actually hover over the rest of the dial. It's a brilliant look next to the black chapter ring and the gray metallic dial. And there's a white strip on those indicators, but they're not actually lume. The lume is actually applied dots on the gray dial, just inside those indicators. Why? I'm not really sure, as I would have thought it would have been easier just to put them on the indicators. Plus, you open yourself up to some alignment errors, which is actually my first complaint. If you look closely, those dots don't quite line up to the indicators, so something's off and needs to be rotated. Otherwise, that metallic gray dial is fantastic looking and has a very, very subtle vertical brushed finish on it. As typical, you do have the Orient logo at the top, along with the words chronograph and 10 bar crammed in below that and the subdials, which I think makes this look a little crowded in an already busy dial. 3 subdials adorn the dial at the 3, 6, and 9, with the one at the 6 being slightly smaller. In person, they have a nice reflective black look, but here with my bright studio light, you can actually see the solar cell underneath. A thin silver film frames each dial just before it sinks down. At the 9, you have running seconds, and the 3 is a 24-hour subdial, while the 6 is minutes elapsed for the chrono. The subdials are the simplest part of this design, but that's because you can't really do anything too ornate, or you'd block the solar cells. A small date window is crammed in between the 3 and 6, and it's actually sunk a bit below the dial, which can make it hard to read, especially with double digits. Design-wise, I think this would have been better off without the date, but having one is better on an everyday watch. The hour and minute hands are my favorite part here. I just love the look. Partially skeletonized sticks with a nice counterweight on each, while just the tips are loomed. They are a little shorter than I like, but they do give the Neo 70's a unique look. And I also like how the skeletonized section of the minute hand allows you to see the loom on the hour hand when it passes under it. The second hand is also a little short, but more importantly, it's a bit thin. While the hour and minute hands have a good amount of white paint, making them easy to see against the dial, the thin second hand just seems to blend in, which in many ways also goes for the hands on the subdials. Now, I'm being a bit nitpicky here, but that's just to give you an idea of what to expect if you were to get one. Overall, I really like the design, and honestly, the dial is the main reason you're going to buy this. Not to mention, I simply love the color options available. The vibrant colors mixed with the depth and complexity of the dial really set this apart from everything else near its price range. Not to mention that it really looks like a dress chrono compared to many of the Citizen Eco drives near this price. Loom is okay, and my comparison here is not really fair to the Neo 70's, as I threw it up against 3 watches that I know have really good loom. You could still see the Neo 70 after 40 minutes, but just barely. Although that's not really surprising here, as it doesn't have that much loom on the hands as it is. For a test that's a little fairer, I put it up against a Vostok Amphibia and a Chinese Cadison. After 40 minutes, it's clearly the winner here. Not just the hands, but the dial as well. So I'll say this, the loom is okay, but not great. But as this is more of a dressy chronograph, it's really more than enough for what you need. As for the bracelet, it is simply the most disappointing part here. It looks very similar to what you get with a Mako or Ray, yet it tapers down to about 20 millimeters at the clasp. And the clasp itself is on par with what you get with a Mako or Ray, but on closer examination, the rest of the bracelet isn't. They look like solid links, and I think they mostly are. But when you look at the back and take a link off, it looks as though the center link of the 3 sections appears to be hollow and folded over, which honestly is rather disappointing. Partially because of the price, and partially because I actually expect a little more from Orient. As a result, the bracelet does feel a little lighter than it should, and it is a little noisy and rattles more than it should. Overall, it will do for a while, but I think most people who are going to import a JDM watch are really just going to swap it out. With or without the bracelet, the watch does wear well. It has a stunning wrist presence without being overly large. Visually, the gray dial version will be more subdued than some of its siblings, but there are other options for those that really want to make their presence known. When it comes to value, you're obviously going to be paying a bit of a premium when ordering a JDM specific model from overseas. So there's of course going to be some cheaper options, specifically by Citizen and Seiko, but I don't think any of them look quite as good. Yet once you start looking at some of the better looking Mecha Quartz watches out there, that's where things can get a little confusing. Overall, I have some mixed feelings when it comes to the Neo 70's, and I'm a little bit disappointed in some ways. And I think that showed with the little bit of nitpicking I did. But I think that's just because I've come to expect more from Orient, and that's from my experiences with the Bambino, a Mako, and now that Kamasu. But the reality is that the Neo 70's isn't really much different than what you'd get with a comparable Seiko or Citizen. And here, I think you're getting a much better looking watch. So if you're interested, as long as you know what you're getting into, I think you'd wind up being very happy with it. Especially if you wanted a Panda and didn't want a straight Daytona homage. Although I think this piece will resonate and appeal to a lot of enthusiasts and collectors just on the novelty of experiencing a solar-powered Orient. And if I'm honest, that's really one of the reasons I picked it up. The real question is whether or not that novelty has any staying power. And with that, only time will tell. For myself, I've actually had this since last September, and while I love the look, recently I really haven't had much of a desire to wear a dressier chronograph. I have plenty of other watches I'd rather wear. Anyway, let me know in the comment what you think about the Orient Neo 70's, and whether or not you'd actually pay a premium for a JDM specific model. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.